Everyone in that house believed the same thing. The child was upstairs, sleeping, resting, maybe upset, maybe sick, maybe just needing space. Whatever the reason, it was easier to accept that explanation than to ask a harder question. And that is where this story begins. Not with a scream, not with a call for help, not with some dramatic warning that everyone ignored. It begins with a quiet assumption that settled over a house and stayed there far too long. For months, they thought the child was upstairs, and because they thought they knew the truth, no one checked. From the outside, the house looked normal. Nothing about it suggested horror. Nothing about it stood out. It was the kind of place people passed every day without thinking twice. Curtains drawn at night, lights on in the kitchen, a television glow flickering through the front window. The routine of ordinary life continuing exactly the way it always had. If you had walked by, you would have seen what everyone else saw. A family home, quiet, private, maybe a little withdrawn, but not unusual. Certainly not the kind of place you would connect to anything dark. Inside, that illusion held together, because everyone played a role in maintaining it, even if they didn't realize they were doing it. When people asked about the child, the answers were always simple. Upstairs, resting, not feeling well, didn't want to come down, didn't want visitors, didn't want to talk. It changed slightly depending on who asked and when they asked, but the meaning stayed the same. The child was there, present, just out of sight. And that was enough. Because most people don't challenge what sounds familiar. Children stay in their rooms. Teenagers withdraw. Sick kids sleep late. Families say things like, "He's upstairs," or "She doesn't feel like coming down," every single day. Nothing about that explanation sounded impossible. Nothing about it sounded like the beginning of a nightmare. That is what made it so effective. At first, no one noticed anything strange because nothing looked strange on the surface. Meals were still cooked. Laundry was still done. People still came and went. The adults in the house moved through their routines with a kind of practiced normalcy that didn't invite suspicion. If anything, what people later remembered most was not that the family seemed panicked, but that they seemed calm. Too calm, maybe, in hindsight, but calm enough in the moment that no one questioned it. The child had already been quiet by nature, which made everything easier. Some children are loud and demanding and impossible not to notice. Others fade into the background, especially in homes where adults are already preoccupied with their own problems. This child belonged to the second category: gentle, reserved, easy to explain away, easy to account for without ever producing, easy to turn into an idea rather than a living person in the minds of everyone around them. That mattered. Because if this had been the kind of child who ran to the door, who interrupted conversations, who demanded to be seen, the lie would have collapsed immediately. But this child had already been half hidden before anything happened. So when the explanations began, they slid into place without resistance. For the first few days, nothing felt urgent. The child was upstairs, the child was sleeping, the child was tired, the child didn't want dinner, the child wasn't feeling well. Every family has stretches like that. Every household has periods where routines shift, and no one outside understands why. There was no reason, at least at first, to think this was anything more than that. But what makes stories like this so disturbing is not the first day, it's the 5th, the 10th, the 20th, the slow accumulation of time around an explanation that should never have survived that long. At some point, the lack of visibility should have mattered. At some point, someone should have insisted, not asked casually, not accepted a vague answer, insisted. But insistence requires discomfort, and discomfort is something most people avoid, especially in family situations, especially in private homes, especially when the adults answering the questions sound certain enough to make doubt feel rude. So people settled for what they were told. The neighbors heard ordinary sounds and assumed ordinary life was continuing. A door opening, a radio in another room, water running through old pipes, footsteps above, or what might have been footsteps above, or what people later convinced themselves had been footsteps above. Memory is strange like that. Once a truth is uncovered, people start searching backward through their minds for clues, for moments they missed, for noises that meant more than they understood at the time. And they always find something. A sound, a silence, a pause too long. But in the moment, none of it feels enough. That is how the upstairs room became a shield. It existed as proof without ever having to be opened. Whenever someone asked, the answer pointed upward. Upstairs, sleeping, resting, quiet. There was always some reason the room remained closed. The child was sensitive. The child had a fever. The child had cried earlier and finally calmed down. The child didn't want to be disturbed. There is power in explanations that sound protective. Once an answer can be framed as care, people hesitate to challenge it. No one wants to be the person who says, "I know you say the child is sleeping, but I need to see for myself." No one wants to be the one who turns concern into confrontation, unless they absolutely have to. And in that house, it took far too long for anyone to feel like they had to. There were warning signs, but they arrived in the softest possible way. A teacher asked why the child had missed so much school. The answer, still recovering, still resting, still having a hard time. A relative called and wanted to speak to the child. The answer, asleep, not feeling well, maybe later. A neighbor mentioned they hadn't seen the child in a while. The answer came with a tired smile, a quick explanation, a gesture toward the staircase. Upstairs, same as always. And each time the lie survived, it got easier to tell. That is one of the ugliest truths in cases like this. The longer a deception works, the more confident it becomes. Every accepted explanation becomes permission to keep going. Every moment of doubt that fades without action becomes proof that the story still holds. And if the story still holds, people keep using it. Weeks passed, then more. At some point, the house itself began to change. Not in a dramatic way. Not enough that anyone walking in would immediately freeze. But there were things. A heaviness in the air. A subtle neglect in places people usually keep up without thinking. A smell that appeared and disappeared depending on where you stood, faint enough to be blamed on old plumbing, damp walls, spoiled food, anything but the truth. That is another thing people do when they are standing too close to horror. They reach for smaller explanations because smaller explanations are survivable. By then, the adults in the house had become very good at managing questions. Not answering them completely, managing them. That is different. A complete answer invites scrutiny. A managed answer closes the conversation before it grows. So they learned which tone to use, which details to include, which details to avoid. Too much information feels rehearsed. Too little feels suspicious. The lie had to sit exactly in the middle. Casual enough to sound real, vague enough to remain flexible. She's upstairs. He's still resting. He's still resting. It was a rough night. Maybe tomorrow. Soon. Those phrases had the rhythm of routine. They were said often enough that even the speakers may have started hearing them as normal. Repetition does that. It smooths the edges off something terrible. It turns a cover story into background noise. And that is how months can pass inside a house where the truth should have been discovered in hours. There was one person, later, who said they never felt right about it. Not enough to accuse anyone, not enough to call police immediately, but enough that the memory stayed with them. It was a family friend who stopped by one afternoon with groceries. The house was quiet. Too quiet, maybe, though quiet on its own meant nothing. They asked if the child wanted anything special, maybe soup, maybe crackers, maybe something sweet to cheer them up. The answer came too fast. Still asleep. Then, almost immediately after, didn't sleep much last night. The contradiction was tiny, so tiny most people would miss it. If the child had not slept much at night, why were they still deeply asleep now? But the friend only noticed the oddness after they were already driving home, after the conversation had passed, after it was too late to go back without seeming strange. That is how doubt works when it arrives late. It always sounds clearer in the car ride home than it did at the front door. Another scene came later, and this one would matter more. A delivery driver arrived with a package that required a signature. Someone signed for it downstairs. Routine, quick, nothing memorable. But as the driver stood there waiting for the electronic confirmation to load, they glanced toward the stairwell and asked, in the casual way strangers do, "Kiddo, feeling any better?" It was the sort of question people ask automatically, just trying to be friendly. The answer was immediate. Still upstairs, then a beat, then, doesn't want anyone to see them like this. Again, it sounded reasonable. More than reasonable. It sounded loving, protective. It turned absence into privacy. And privacy is something people respect. That was the genius of it, if you can call something that monstrous genius. The lie did not just explain the child's absence. It made seeing the child seem inappropriate. Each excuse pulled a little more distance around that room. Upstairs stopped feeling like a place anyone should check. It became a boundary, and once a lie becomes a boundary, most people stay on their side of it. Still, lies create pressure. They have to. The world keeps asking for ordinary evidence of life. School notices arrive, appointments are missed, people call, family members press gently, then more firmly, and every missed interaction has to be absorbed somehow. Every demand for visibility has to be redirected back into the story. The child is resting, the child is overwhelmed, the child isn't up for visitors, the child is upstairs. If you listen to that kind of repetition long enough, it begins to sound less like an explanation and more like an incantation, something said over and over, not to convince others, but to hold reality in place. But reality never holds forever. The first real crack came not from suspicion, but from routine bureaucracy. It often does. Systems do not feel emotion. Systems just keep asking the same practical questions until silence itself becomes suspicious. In this case, the school kept calling. Attendance concerns turned into welfare concerns. Welfare concerns turned into an expectation that someone, somewhere, needed to visually confirm the child's condition. A note would no longer do it. A voice over the phone would no longer do it. The world outside the house had begun demanding proof. And that changes everything. Because once proof is demanded, a lie that depended on distance begins to collapse. At first, the answers came the same way they always had. The child is ill. The child is resting. The child is not in shape to come to the phone. The child is upstairs. But the more often those same phrases were repeated, the more brittle they became. What once sounded reasonable, now sounded rehearsed. What once brought sympathy, now began to raise irritation. And irritation is dangerous to a lie, because irritated people stop being polite. Someone needed to see the child. That was the new reality. And inside the house, that reality had nowhere to go, except toward panic. The adults there had built everything around one basic assumption, that no one would push hard enough to cross the threshold between being told and seeing for themselves. For a while, they were right, but not forever. Eventually, every story meets the point where it must either produce evidence or collapse under the weight of its own repetition, and they could not produce the child. That is when the atmosphere changed from tense to desperate. The answers became shorter, the smiles became strained, the timing of responses started slipping. There is always a point in long deceptions where exhaustion begins to show. Maintaining a lie is work, not just the speaking, but the remembering, the tracking, the emotional management, the constant anticipation of what the next question will be, and whether the story you gave last week still fits the one you need today. Over time, that strain leaks into everything. People around them began noticing small things they had ignored before. The way the adults seemed to answer before a question was fully asked. The way they positioned themselves near the stairs. The way the house seemed carefully arranged to keep certain doors closed, certain lines of sight blocked. It did not look like panic. It looked like over-control. And over-control is one of those signals people rarely understand immediately, but recognize the moment everything else is revealed. For months, they thought the child was upstairs. That sentence would later repeat through interviews, family conversations, statements, and headlines, because it sounded impossible once the truth emerged. But inside the story, it did not feel impossible while it was happening. That is the point. Things that become monstrous in retrospect rarely announce themselves that way in real time. They survive by being explainable one day at a time. Until the day they aren't. The call that changed everything did not come from a screaming witness or some dramatic burst of confession. It came from someone tired of being told the same thing and receiving nothing back. Tired enough to stop asking politely. Tired enough to say, "No, I need to see the child now." That sentence, more than anything else, shattered the protective fiction of the upstairs room. Because now the lie was no longer being measured against sympathy. It was being measured against access. And access is where hidden truths die. The house, which had absorbed months of questions without breaking, suddenly felt smaller. The staircase no longer pointed upward toward explanation. It pointed upward toward exposure. Every step anyone imagined taking toward that room now carried a different weight. Not concern, discovery. Inside, the silence tightened, the calculations, the realization that there was no new phrase left to use, no softer excuse available, no way to keep the room closed forever, because whatever was upstairs was no longer an idea the adults could manage with language. It was about to become a fact. And once facts arrive, stories don't matter anymore. At first, they tried to delay, just a little longer, another excuse, another reason the child could not be disturbed, another appeal to privacy. But the pressure had changed now. People were no longer asking because they were curious. They were asking because they were beginning to understand that something was deeply wrong. That shift is everything. Because once concern hardens into suspicion, every answer is measured differently. Tone changes, body language changes, even silence changes. What once sounded protective now sounds defensive. What once sounded calm now sounds controlled. And control, in situations like this, always draws attention. Someone moved toward the staircase. Not quickly, not dramatically, just one step, then another, like they still wanted to believe this would all resolve into something ordinary. A sleeping child, an exaggerated misunderstanding, a family under stress. Anything except what the air in that house was already beginning to suggest. And that was when the adults tried one last time to stop it. Not with force, not at first, with words. "She's asleep. Please don't wake her. This is upsetting enough already." Every sentence aimed at the same thing. Buy more time. Hold the story together a little longer. Keep the room upstairs from turning into a room downstairs people could no longer ignore. But the staircase was no longer just a staircase now. It had become a line between explanation and truth, and someone kept climbing. Each step changed the house. The silence got heavier. The smell, faint before, sharpened just enough to stop feeling like imagination. The hallway upstairs looked normal in the way nightmares often do. Too ordinary, too still, too quiet. Closed doors, dim light. The sort of hallway any family home might have. And at the end of it, the room everyone had been talking about for months, as if talking about it was the same as seeing inside. The door was closed. Of course it was closed. That detail would later feel so obvious it was almost insulting. Every story had pointed toward this room, and yet no one had opened it. They had let the idea of what was behind the door outweigh the need to know. They had trusted language more than sight. That trust ended there. The hand on the knob hesitated, not out of fear exactly, more out of that last human hope that the truth will still turn out to be survivable if you open the door slowly enough. Then it turned, and the story that had held a house together for months died in a second. Because the child was not upstairs the way everyone had been told. The child had not been sleeping, had not been resting, had not been sick. All the phrases that had floated through that house for weeks, then months, collapsed at once under the weight of what was actually there. And in that instant, every ignored warning reassembled itself into something horrifyingly clear. The missed school days, the unanswered calls, the closed curtains, the strange smell, the over-controlled adults, the careful distance around the upstairs room, the refusal to let anyone see, the insistence that everything was fine. It was never fine. And the worst part was not just what they found, it was how long the lie had been allowed to live before anyone forced it to die. And once that door opened, nothing in that house meant the same thing again. This is Forgotten Evidence. Buried Truths. Subscribe now for more similar cases.